Hi, I'm Kelly Demore. I am on the Parent Advisory Board for the Arlington Youth Health and Safety Coalition. And today we're going to talk about vaping. It's kind of a vaping 101 for parents who may have heard about it but don't know much about it. So here we have today, we have Karen Koretsky. She is the Coalition Director of the Arlington Youth Health and Safety Coalition. And we have Dr. Patrick Egan. He is the Associate Medical Director for Primary Care at MIT. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
So let's start with a real simple. What is vaping? Explain exactly what it is for anyone who may have heard the word, but they don't really quite know what it entails. Karen, I want to start with you.
Vaping has become a phenomenon. Some people in the medical field are calling it an epidemic. It started as a way to consume nicotine products. It was marketed as a tool, a vape, that was used for people who wanted to quit smoking tobacco or reduce their dependency to nicotine. What happened is the products came to the market in flavors that appealed to young people. And so young people embraced the product more than the older people who were hoping to quit. So it's become a phenomenon for nicotine ingestion, THC ingestion now among young people.
So you talked about flavors. What kind of flavors are we talking about?
So, traditional combustible cigarettes would come in regular tobacco flavor and menthol. Now we have flavors in the vaping industry of creme brulee and strawberry and popcorn and unicorn's breath and all kinds of things that clearly are not going to appeal to a 30-something person. It's clearly developed to appeal to young people, to children.
So we talk about these flavors. What are the kids using? So if and when they're vaping, what exactly do they use?
I think it starts with a curiosity, maybe a sense of rebelliousness, and they're vaping. I'm hearing mango to be the most popular flavor among young people.
Wow.
Feel free to weigh in if you've heard.
The flavors are sort of the whole coin of the realm. The kids will talk about which ones they enjoy and which ones they could get a hold of, because it's still illegal for these kids to be accessing this stuff. The gadget itself is a little piece of plastic about the size of a thumb drive. Yeah. And within that plastic gadget, there's a little bit of a heat element that will vaporize these liquids stored in tiny little pods, little sort of slot-in pods that have liquid that can be easily turned into an aerosol. You breathe it in, it's got the flavor, you breathe it out, it doesn't really have any smell. But the kids they like them very much because they look either like pens or like thumb drives or completely innocuous little things. Teachers and parents don't necessarily see them easily when they're sort of being used because the vape smoke, evaporative, disappears. It doesn't have that telltale smell that we all remember from when we were kids with, cigarette smell on your clothes. Kids are doing it in school where the smoke evaporates, disappears, and there's no way to sort of pick it up around the corner. So kids are able to do this a little bit more easily in school than ever they were able to do with cigarettes.
How are they getting them? So how do they get the jewels, and where do they get the liquid?
Well, first of all, none of the products are FDA regulated, so that's really important to point out. Yeah. And I think to Pat's point, when they developed this technology, they had these kids, this generation of kids in mind. These gadgets are sleek, they are sort of highly engineered, easily hidden. They plug into your computer to charge up, so there's a link between being equipment, for a computer. The way that I'm hearing from students that they're obtaining them is through friends, so somebody's got an older sibling maybe who's buying in quantity, and then they're selling to younger people. They're going to neighboring communities where they're not going to know anybody, and they're not necessarily, carded because they're supposed to be over 21 to purchase. But like with alcohol, they know when there's certain establishments that are lenient. And there's also some ways to purchase them online. The portals online don't have many effective blocks to stop a young person from purchasing them.
So they can purchase them at smoke shops or pretty much anywhere?
They
or?
can, well, tobacco retailers here in Arlington can sell jewels, but they can't, and electronic cigarettes, but they can't sell the flavored juices, as they're called,
Okay.
or pods. So yeah, they can buy the product.
So the juices are they're nicotine? Or, you know?
Yeah, so Juul is the most commonly used electronic cigarette that's out there right now. And they have every flavor you can imagine, you know, the 64 crayon collection of flavors. And currently all of their flavors have nicotine, 3% or 5%, depending on which flavor. And essentially, you know, this is from the premise of we're using this to try to help people quit smoking. Well, that's nice, but it's not really what's happening.
Yeah.
All of the little juices have these doses of nicotine in them, and they're carefully calibrated. Essentially, one pod is one pack of cigarettes. There are about 200 hits in each of these little pods. 20 hits, or about 10 hits is one cigarette. 20 of those makes up a pack of cigarettes. So they're calibrated. I'm not sure it's coincidental, of course, but the basic deal is that you can sort of smoke this discreetly in school or anywhere you want, and you know that's what kids are doing now.
Yeah. You know, interesting. I was reading somewhere that sales of Juuls grew in 2016 to 2017 600%. And I know there's definitely been a backlash because they are marketing to children. If you have unicorn breath,
Yes.
you know, that is not for somebody who is quitting smoking. So nicotine. Now, can these Juuls also have marijuana? Like, what is the difference there?
So yeah, one can put anything into the little pods. The Juul company and all the other sort of above board electronic cigarette makers are not doing that.
Okay.
But it's really, really easy to access both marijuana and hash as ingredients for pods that are available on the internet.
Okay.
I was looking around as I prepared for this presentation, and with a couple of clicks, you could get to marijuana, THC, whatever you might want to put in there. It's really, really easy. There are, in fact, ways to do it yourself that are available on YouTube if you want to go and look for, you know, you have to dig a little deeper, but it's doable. You can create that stuff at home. It's technologically a little clever, but not insurmountable in any way. So kids could even do that potentially.
Wow. So, you know, another vaping instrument that I've heard about is a dab pen. So I guess it's a little different from a Juul. So a Juul looks a little bit like a USB device, like you mentioned, sleek. But what does a dab pen look like? And is it the same? Is it different?
The basic functions are the same. Instead of having a liquid pod or liquid juice, there's a waxy pod that is the source of the vape instead. The pens are more pen-shaped. They're quite literally, they look like a pen. You could carry them in your pocket. The Juul device itself, which is the more common electronic cigarette, looks like a thumb drive, but there are a whole variety of other shapes. There's even one that looks like an asthma inhaler.
Wow.
Yeah, that's actually a marijuana dosing device called an Aero inhaler, and it's available on the internet. You have to attest that you are 21 with a click.
Exactly.
And so all sorts of gadgets, but they're all innocuous looking, of course. They're made to be, you know, sort of discreet so that you can do this wherever you want. And if you're 21 and it's not a problem, it doesn't really need that kind of careful camouflage. But if you're 17, you're trying to do it in school, you really need to have a way to keep it hidden, basically.
Yeah.
And even in these shapes can be hidden in plain sight, but it's not not apparent.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. In December, the CDC called vaping an epidemic, and that it had grown 78% from the previous year. So that's kind of a broader picture of what's happening today with youth. What are we seeing in Arlington? So what are we seeing in the high school? What are we seeing in the middle schools when it comes to vaping?
Well, one of the things I think that is important to point out is that the use of Juuls in electronic cigarettes and vaping has become embedded in the culture of our young people. So it's something that they're exposed to in movies, in music videos, in Instagram, on social media. There's special lingo for use. So it's become embedded as a part of their culture and a part of their generation. There's been some theorists that have even said that they believe that this generation is using because they take pride in the fact that it's theirs, which is ridiculous. But it's almost like, their rebellion. So what we're seeing in Arlington is we are seeing high rates of use at the high school. I started monitoring tobacco violations for Arlington High in 2015. At that time, we would get maybe 8 or 9 students who were caught on campus smoking cigarettes. Then around 2016, 2017, something really strange started happening. We started seeing more e-cigarette use. By the time 2017 came around, the 1 or 2 e-cigarette users now became a roster of students with violations using vapes. So exclusively, no more combustible cigarettes. There was a shift, a cultural shift. In 2017, we had about 22 students caught with vaping violations, and I always emphasize those are the ones that are caught.
Yeah.
As of this year, right now, we have, I think, 20 students who have received a vaping violation. The middle school is seeing vaping violations, so we're seeing use as early as middle school. So it's quite a problem because it's imposing on their school day.
Yeah.
It's changing the culture. It's changing their brain structure.
Yeah.
It's making them predisposed to addiction. And the students who choose not to vape are being exposed to something that is now being referred to by health professionals as third-hand smoke. And that's the sticky, tarry residue, because vape is a misnomer. It's not vape. It's not water vapor. It is actually like putting your mouth up to an aerosol hairspray can and sucking in the contents. So when they exhale this, what's left is all these heavy metal components, carcinogens, and a sticky, tar-like substance that can permeate paint, some people are saying. So because these are new products and we don't have any long-term studies, there's this residue now being left in schools and on people's clothing, and it's not fair that people who aren't using are also being exposed to it.
And with vaping being so pervasive, are we talking in schools nicotine? Or are we thinking that they're also smoking marijuana while they're in school too? I mean, what is your thought there? And they're doing it like this, right? Like they hide them in their sleeves typically, right?
Right.
Yeah.
They hide them. They use them in class. They use them in the bathroom between classes. I want to emphasize the fact that while we're seeing a huge increase in use, that doesn't mean everybody's doing it. And I think that's really important to point out, that there's a large majority of students who are not using. We have student activists in the 84 Club at Arlington High who are anti-tobacco activists. And they're trying to help their peers. So there's plenty of students who are not using.
Right.
The ones who are vaping, typically what happens is they experiment, usually in middle school, out of curiosity. And then before they know it, they become addicted. The process of inhaling something foreign and a stimulant into your body becomes normalized. Then they graduate over to saying, oh, okay, well, I didn't, nothing big happened with the nicotine. Let's try THC. Let's get more of an effect. And then what typically happens is they cross over to cigarettes, traditional combustible cigarettes, because they can't afford the vape pens anymore, and it's easier for them to smoke cigarettes.
Huh. Actually, you touched on it that I want to dig in a little bit, is the effects of vaping on a developing brain. Pat, if you could talk about that.
So teenagers have a brain that is undergoing as much change in the teenage years as it does in the infant years. There are, think of it as neurons frantically trying to find the right connection to make. Primarily what we're worried about, the end development of the brain is something called the prefrontal cortex right here. And it's where you do your decision making, your executive function, and sort of your risk assessment kind of stuff. This is the last part of the brain to develop. One way to think about it is you can't rent a car till you're 25. The rental agencies know something. Up to 25 is about where your brain is developing. Kids are ingesting all of these inhalants, whether it's THC or just nicotine, but all the other crap that comes in that vape smoke, and all of those chemicals have an effect on how the neurons are finding their connections. The development of the brain is under lots and lots and lots of pressures normally. As we grow up, our brain deals with our environment and it deals with all the other stressors and pressures that we feel, and that's a normal thing. Adding nicotine into that changes how that development goes. There's not great data in kids or in humans because it's really hard to do an experiment like that. In all sorts of other animal models, you can see a real change in how those connections are made, and it leads to changes in behavior in rats and in other animals that have been experimented on. We presume that the same is true, and epidemiologically we know that kids who are using nicotine in heavy doses, and certainly marijuana, are behaving very differently. There's some very strong associations with decreased academic achievement and a whole variety of other kind of performance issues. It's not clear whether this carries on. If you were to stop, whether you're going to continue like that. The problem is that we don't know, and it's reasonably likely that whatever the change is that occurred while you were using this stuff very heavily, it's likely to have an impact down the road. We don't know what it is, and I'm not sure I'd be willing to risk it because I suspect that there is some impact. I can't tell you what the data show. We don't have good follow-on data for that. But we know that kids who smoke cigarettes end up at higher rates of mental illness, more problems with academic achievement, a bunch of other medical health related issues as well. It would be easy enough to extrapolate from just the use of nicotine. One of the big differences between e-cigarettes and combustible cigarettes, regular cigarettes that we think about, is that the nicotine is about the same, the exposure to nicotine from both of the gadgets. The difference, and this is why originally people talked about how safe e-cigarettes were, is that they don't have all the other smoke, the tars and all the other burning chemicals that come out of essentially burning a leaf. The issue is that even removing that, those things are the things that affect probably your risk for cancer, your risk for emphysema, bronchitis, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. But the nicotine is the stuff that has the cognitive impact, and that's just the same. So the difference between combustible cigarettes, the regular cigarettes that we're used to, plus e-cigarettes is presence in regular cigarette smoke of all the burning residue of burning leaves. It's like putting your head over a campfire, really. The nicotine is the same in both, and the effects of nicotine are the same in both, and potentially they're more concentrated because kids are using the e-cigarettes even more. We worry in combustible cigarettes about the harm that the smoke does to the lungs, lung cancer, all the other bad changes that we see with either bronchitis and emphysema or some susceptibility to infections. However, with the e-cigarettes, that's not the case. The real problem with e-cigarettes is that the nicotine is present, and it has all of the brain effects. Both regular cigarettes, combustible cigarettes, as well as e-cigarettes have these very strong brain effects. Nicotine is all over your brain, and it interacts with all of the various neurochemicals and the development of neurons. That is still present just as strongly. And that's why I suspect that we're going to find out over the next several years that e-cigarettes are causing the same kind of cognitive impact that regular cigarette smoking does.
And I wanted to speak, I'm always reading studies and articles about things, and I'm not a physician, so I don't have a clinical perspective on it. But one of the studies I read is because the liquids that are being put in e-cigarettes are not regulated by the FDA, they've even found some of them to contain traces of alcohol. So when they're to help with the ignition process of the e-cigarette. So a young child who's taking a hit of nicotine is also inhaling vaporized alcohol. So that would be their first exposure to not only nicotine, but also alcohol.
Yeah.
Another thing is from a behavioral perspective. Here's a child who was raised through elementary school learning about the harms of cigarette smoking. Now suddenly they're taking a step into risk behavior because vaping and juuling is normalized in their circle. If they're going to take that risk, then what's going to stop them from taking the next risk? Yeah. So it behaviorally makes them more willing to take a risk and to experiment with risk behavior.
That whole gateway, yeah.
And then the third thing, as Pat spoke to, is the reward system. The nicotine gives the brain a reward, a sense, a feeling, And I've read studies that imply, and Pat can speak to this better, but because it's messing with the reward system of the developing brain, when that young person has to get their wisdom teeth out at 16 and suddenly gets a prescription for a Percocet or an opioid, which we hope doesn't happen, but could, it makes them more likely to develop an addiction because the brain is primed for the reward, right?
Yeah. The adolescent brain is different from almost every other life stage, is very much on reward and not so much on sort of negative consequence. When we're little, we have a whole lot of negative consequences. Kids develop stranger anxiety. That's a very good thing. Yeah. By the time you're 15 or 16 or 17, you have very little sort of world wariness or circumspection. It's all about, let's try this. And the potential reward is much more strongly presented in the brain function. All of the reward centers light up and all of the risk-averse centers are very, very quiet. Yeah. In that setting, all of this kind of activity, lots and lots of nicotine, which triggers the reward centers, lights up the brain. And so those kinds of effects are very, very strong. And it makes it easier down the road for other kinds of stimuli to light up the brain in the same way. So we want to be really careful about that. Kids are already, as we know, very, very risk-taking in their behaviors. Yeah. In many ways, that's really, really good. Kids have to test themselves. They have to learn their limits. That's all to the benefit of our species, really. But in this case, by making those cost-benefit analyses incorrect, basically, they're always going to get these positive stimuli. The basic effect is that kids aren't gauging those kinds of decisions as well as they ought to. Yeah. This comes back to the decision making in the risk sort of taking behaviors that we want to encourage a little, but not very much. Kids doing this kind of stuff are going to be very risky.
Yeah. And if I could speak to two experiences I had with students, one of the things that we do, the coalition, is we partner with ACMi and the schools. And when a student is caught with a tobacco violation, we don't want to kick them out of school or give them anything that's going to remove the protective factors that school puts in place. Yeah. So what we do is we engage them in a series of 2 tobacco educations, but what they really are, they're motivational interviews with either me or a clinician from ACMi to try to learn more about their use and see if there's any red flags for potential other risk behaviors. One student I spoke with was a younger student, a 7th grader, who had been experimenting with a vape. And when I asked him what was going on in his mind as the scenario unfolded when he was offered a vape in school, on school premises, he said to me, I felt scared and I felt curious all at the same time, which is exactly
what you're talking about. Yeah.
Right. You want to see the fear and the curiosity balance each other, and clearly in this case it didn't. One was way out of whack with the other. Yeah. That's the kind of stuff that's going to lead some kids to get into more trouble, and we really want to sort of pay attention to that as we go.
And when I was able to reassure him and say, that's exactly what your brain should be doing at this stage, now moving forward, what's going to happen when other things are offered to you, he was so relieved. He was thinking he was a bad kid because he made not the best choice. another student, a high schooler, who I think was a junior or senior, and working on trying to curtail an addiction to nicotine, described the first time he took a hit from a Juul and said he literally felt it travel through his blood system. And I said, how did you feel? What changes did you notice? And he said, I felt like every nerve in my body was alive.
Yeah. That's nicotine triggers that kind of a response in some people. For anyone who's ever taken, many of us have tried cigarettes, the first drag of a cigarette, the nicotine is what gives you that sort of rush. It's, for some people, kind of scary, but for a lot of kids, it's
thrilling.
Really neat. Thrilling is exactly the word.
Yeah.
And let's do it again. And it's never quite as exciting as the first time. And once you get addicted, it's all about, like, you're just avoiding the discomfort. But at the very beginning, there's no question that the vape cigarette makers know this. It's no accident that they have dosed their nicotine at just the right amount. My very favorite anecdote of all of this is that, Juul, the big vape maker, has just been bought by Altria, the big cigarette maker. I wonder why. The cigarette people say, oh, this is a great way to sort of increase our sales. And so it's just that kind of, like, it's a lot of marketing, much more than even the clever science. They're figuring out ways to get these kids hooked.
Getting them in really young.
And if I could say one other thing to Pat's point about the cigarettes of our era or before, a combustible cigarette, you would take a hit of a combustible cigarette and it burns. Some people would report feeling dizzy. Juuls are made so that the first moment a young person takes a hit, it's smooth, it doesn't burn, it doesn't hurt.
Mango,
unicorn breath. You don't have bad breath, your teeth aren't going to turn yellow. I mean, they've manufactured a very pleasant experience for them to become nicotine addicts.
Okay, so what do parents do? What do they need to look for? And then what is your advice in terms of how they approach this if they think that their kids are vaping or looking to vape, or they know that their friends are vaping? What do you think?
I mean, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that conversations about substance use begin at 9 years old. So that's way before a student is in middle school. You start having these conversations. Yeah. It's advised that conversations happen frequently and regularly, and that there's not a lot of judgment, but more, tell me what you're seeing in school. Tell me what you're seeing among your friends. How does that make you feel? Have you ever been curious to try? Let's talk about why and how that might play out if you did. Talking to them on that kind of level, I think can be really helpful. As far as signs go, that a young person is using either vaping nicotine or THC, and Pat will speak to this probably better too from his perspective, but what I'm seeing and hearing of are young people isolating, so they're spending a lot of time because they're addicted and they need to do that. You're certainly going to hear a cough because they do cause coughing symptoms. Okay. A lot of clearing of throat, some spitting. You might smell something fruity or sickeningly sweet in their room or on their clothing. Money starts to be a concern because it's an expensive habit. Yeah. What other signs?
Yeah, the challenge with all of this, the e-cigarettes are not very smelly. The smells that Karen's talking about are fairly subtle. Yeah. In the old days, cigarettes smelled like cigarettes. Everyone could tell who was smoking and who wasn't. And marijuana was the same way. Yeah. You can always pick that smell up. The behavioral stuff, I think, is the biggest key. And even that's really, really fraught because teenagers spend a lot of time by themselves. Yeah. It's a normal thing. They're sleepier. They are starting to spend money. All of those kinds of things are tricky. Yeah. I'd go all the way back to, the conversations that parents are having with kids are the most important piece of this. We all know our kids. We probably know our kids as well as anybody in the world, each of us for our own. And when behavioral changes start to happen that don't feel normal, and I really, that's a vague answer, but parents always have a suspicion. Yeah. My own take on this is, as a parent, your job is to be super suspicious. The kids will talk you down if they need to, and they will in some future date appreciate that you cared enough to be suspicious about it. But being careful with your kids, talking to them a lot, asking them questions, making them prove things, that's okay.
Yeah.
Kids want to appreciate that their parents are a little bit more hard on them. Being your kid's friend because you don't want to upset him, that may not be sufficiently effective. You really, I think, want to be a little harder on that.
I mean, I'm surprised about how a lot of parents don't talk about these types of things.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, in my opinion, and I'm not a doctor, nor am I an expert in any way, but talking to your kids early and making it very normal and part of the conversation, and kind of getting to it before, a couple years before. I think really helps. You kind of have a pulse. I mean, again, you could be surprised and you have to go with your gut, but...
I think if one thinks about it in the same way that we have the sex talk or the alcohol talk or the drugs talk, it's all that same kind of, like, I don't want to encourage you, but I need to make sure that you understand what's going on.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff is critical for kids. And having what will likely turn into a series of conversations, that's crucial. You'll driving the kid to some event where the kid's trapped in the car. That's a golden moment, and in its own weird way. As much as we all are uncomfortable with these chats, and I talk about this all day long with my patients, and I still found it hard with my kids. For someone who doesn't talk about this kind of stuff on a regular basis, it must be very difficult, but it's incredibly worthwhile, and the kids will grouse about it, but down the road, they'll be kind of grateful. They may never even be able to express it, but that kind of stuff is really, really, really important to them. They need to know this stuff, and they need to know it from someone whom they trust.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of planning to talk about this and planning to address subjects that are going to be kind of uncomfortable ahead of time is a big deal.
And I have an idea for a springboard. This is, I'll dare call it, a nefarious industry that is preying on young people to become their replacement smokers. And if you look on Instagram and places like that, there's advertisements, there's lingo, there's hashtags, there's all kinds of things that refer to the vaping world. So you could say to your child, hey, when you were doing research for your homework project, have you ever seen one of these ads? Or do you even know what it is? Do you know what vaping is? I mean, you can start to ask questions. Have you seen any of your friends vaping in school? So I think sort of asking questions about their exposure and knowledge is a way to not accuse per se, but to see what they're familiar with.
And we have the YRBS, if people don't know about that. That's the Youth Risk Behavior Survey.
Yeah.
And it surveys the middle school and the high school, right?
Yes.
So you can kind of get a sense of generally what's happening. And what I think we want to do is communicate when that survey could potentially be coming out. We've been talking about that. So that could be an entry point of, hey, I heard you took a survey. What are you hearing? Or any time. The Parent Advisory Board, as an example, can kind of help with that hook. We're going to try to get the word out and do that sort of stuff so that,
thank you.
Yes, you can trap them in the minivan. I do that a lot. But that you can also find a hook with Instagram or other things that are kind of happening, right? In the
I mean, we had to adapt the YRBS. You were asking. It's going to be offered, I think, in April and May at both the high school and middle school. The YRBS was surveyed in 2000. It's been going on for decades, and it's done throughout the country as the Monitoring the Future survey. But the YRBS was last done in 2017. At that time, the survey had 10 questions pertaining to cigarette use and 2 about e-cigarettes. There wasn't even the word vape in them.
Yeah.
So we worked hard, myself and the wellness department, to revamp this survey that's being rolled out in 2018. And now we have 8 questions on vaping. I don't think there's any reference to e-cigarettes. And we reduced the cigarette smoking questions to only, I think, 4. So that's a real indication of how there's been a cultural shift.
And how quickly it happened,
How
right?
quickly,
I mean,
yeah, it's
like
crazy.
So resources. So one thing I will do is have a little mini commercial for the Parent Advisory Board has a website that we're launching called raisingresilientyouth.org. And what we're trying to do is get a lot of the resources that Pat and Karen were mentioning onto the site. So it's really more of a portal. There's definitely a ton of resources in the town of Arlington site, but we want to make it a little bit more front and center and pull some other resources as well. We'll have a calendar, we'll have some other things there. That clearly is just, sort of 101 level. That's really all we're trying to do and what we're trying to serve. So talk to us about other resources for parents so that they're aware if in fact they need to go somewhere, where can they go in Arlington?
I think they can go. I think the parents have put together this fabulous resource in Arlington with lots of links. There's regional and national resources. This handout is from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It's a campaign called Get Outraged. They have these vaping materials that parents can download online. There's the Stanford School of Medicine's toolkit.
Yeah.
What else?
The Surgeon General has a website that has a lot of information about this.
Yeah.
The CDC, Center for Disease Control,
Yeah.
has lots of information.
Yeah.
Any of the medical
Harvard University.
University, American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Family Physicians, American College of Physicians, any place, if one goes to Google, there's a lot of good stuff. There's going to be a lot of stuff that sneaks in. One of the other marketing features that many of these companies have been able to do is to identify keywords. If you type in e-cigarette or Juul, you're going to be getting ads. I did it this morning when I was doing some research. I'm sure that the ads for the next few weeks are going to be all about e-cigarettes on the little margins of my websites that I'm visiting. I'm going to be looking at a soccer website and there's going to be Juul ads on the sideline.
Following you around.
Absolutely. It's not an accident that these folks are trying to reach out everywhere. Yeah. Nevertheless, it wouldn't be a bad idea to even just go in and simply Google this stuff. There's a lot of great stuff. Center for Drug-Free America.
Partnership for Drug-Free Kids.
All of those places have really good resources. And a lot of it is even some model conversations. We talk about this like it's easy to have these conversations, and it can be brutal. It can be really hard and leave a parent drained. The kids bounce out of the car and they're fine, but the parents feel really, really stressed by it. Nevertheless, there are some really good ways to have these kinds of conversations. Karen touched on one from the American Academy of Pediatrics, but there's a bunch of other stuff that's out there. And just looking around, one can find some helpful questions and helpful ways to frame the discussion. I think to a great extent, that's what parents ought to be thinking about. Not so much, what are the chemical underpinnings of all of this. It's bad stuff going into a kid's lungs and into his brain. It's
at a really bad time.
At a really bad time, yes. And that's exactly the point. Beyond that, the chemistry and the science is still kind of murky. I mean, we know that bad stuff is happening, but this is, as you noted, hasn't really even been a thing for more than 3 or 4 years. Yeah. And we're just finding out how this goes over the medium term. We haven't gotten to a long-term kind of situation yet. I am really, really suspicious that this is going to turn out to be a genuine public health, real crisis over the next several years because so many kids have been exposed yet again in the same way that, it's like we're back when we were kids and, cigarette companies told you how safe they were.
Right.
That is now, we all know that cigarettes are bad, and even kids know that cigarettes are bad.
But somehow this is different.
My daughter made a comment. She saw a kid who was standing on the side of the road smoking, and she said, "Oh God, he looks so uncool." And I thought, wow, when I was a kid, the cool kids smoked, and she said, no, all the cool kids are vaping now. I'm like, oh dear. But that's exactly the dilemma that we face is, what do we do how do we help our kids avoid this?
Yeah.
And perhaps a bigger question too, and one for the future is, why are they choosing this behavior? Why are they taking this risk beyond their brain development and their brains being wired to lead them to taking risks? What I'm hearing from a lot of students is they think it's going to help them relax. They're turning to it to help them deal with stress. So that's another thing, to sort of keep a pulse on your child's anxiety and stress level. And if the topic of vaping comes up, make sure you emphasize the fact that nicotine is a stimulant. It is not. It may make you feel energized, but it's not going to ultimately lead to relaxation.
Right.
That is a myth. Right. And I want to put a pitch out for the coalition. The coalition is your organization here in town. We have fabulous parents like you who do outreach and have produced the website. Other fabulous parents like Pat who come to our coalition meetings and are a wealth of knowledge. So if anybody has additional questions, they should always feel free to call us, because that's what we're here for. So one of the students at the high school with a tobacco violation was a younger student who had their second tobacco violation, and they were caught vaping in class. So when I say tobacco, that refers to vaping. And when I met with that student to talk about, what had happened, I asked, why were you vaping in class? And he, got really upset and said, I think I'm addicted. So one of the things I want to point out is I think, there's an opportunity for parents here to really hopefully keep an open heart and an open mind and try to help these young people, because I'm hearing more and more reports of young people who are addicted, feeling helpless, not knowing how they can stop. And as Dr. Egan said, there's many ways that they can, but they need adult support to do that. Yeah. We're trying all kinds of things at the high school. We're exploring new programs to try to reach out to this population and help them. We offer hypnosis at the library, free sessions, behavior modification, also at the library, free sessions, so it's off-site and they can drop in. But I really think it's important to support a child who comes to you and says, I think I'm addicted. Yeah. I think it's important, if a parent can, to say, how can I help you? Let's get you to the doctor. Let's work up a plan.
Yeah. Now, can you take is there a urine test as an example for nicotine?
There are urine tests that look at whether people are ingesting nicotine. Insurance companies use these all the time. If you tell them you're a non-smoker and it turns out you have nicotine in your urine, that leads to trouble for them. You can do it as a screening thing. We don't typically screen kids that way because by the time there's an issue, it's pretty obvious, most typically. Yeah. And most circumstances don't really sort of allow for that.
And drug testing your child is a topic maybe for another conversation, because that's not something that I think is advisable unless it's an extreme circumstance. So that's a whole nother topic. Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to go back to the dab pen a little bit and some of the symptoms, right? We're talking about. So for the dab pen and the wax, if they're using dab, or they're dabbing, or whatever the terminology is, I'm sure I'm using the wrong terminology. What are the symptoms? So do you smell the pot like you would when we grew up? Are there what is it different from what we're used to?
It's definitely different from what we're used to.
Yeah.
There is a little bit of that sweet smell, less of the smoky sort of stuff that goes with it, but the sweetness is there. Again, it's a pretty vague smell in the same way that sort of after smell of the other vape ingredients can be present, but not really very strong. Kids who ingest THC will get somewhat red eyes, and it may not be quite as obvious as with smoking leaf tobacco or leaf marijuana because of the smoke and the whole deal, but they'll still have some of that. The THC will have some impact like that. Behaviorally, when you're stoned, you're stoned, and that is something that kids act a little differently when they're stoned. Right. Adults as well.
So that hasn't changed at all.
That hasn't changed. In fact, that is the whole point behind this. And so that kind of stuff, it's not nearly as obvious as it would have been 5 years ago when kids are smoking pot. But now there still are some signs that you can identify with your kids.
And the smell is more skunky. When I've walked past people that are smoking, I smell more of a skunky smell than I remember from the days of my youth. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. Another question, how much does this stuff cost? Like, again, if we're looking, I think you talked about looking at if they're, their own money or they're spending, how much does a Juul cost, or the liquid, or a dab pen, or anything like that?
There's so many on the market, but a student can buy a Juul starter kit for about $40. Now, again, if they're buying from friends, I don't know. But on the market value is about $40, and a pod pack, I think it's usually 4 in a pack, is $10 a pod. So it's a $40 if you get a 4-pack, or $10 a pod.
Yeah. And so what it costs for a kid who's underage buying it illegally in school is probably more than that. So that if kids are going through, let's say, half a pack a day, that's half a pod. I don't know how much the different kids are going to be smoking individually, but if it's a half a pack, let's say, that's going to be $5 or $10 or maybe more, $5 or $10 each day that they've got to come up with.
Yeah.
For a high school kid, that's a lot of money. And so that's going to be a place where perhaps we as parents have some leverage and can gain a little insight. That is, it becomes potentially a limiting factor for these kids. However, that can lead to some other behaviors that are more concerning. So
yeah.
And the fact that you can order anything on the internet and have it delivered to your home or to a friend's home is something that parents need to be aware of. So looking at what's coming in these packages and where is it coming from, and or did the package arrive that disappeared?
Yeah.
You kind of have to monitor your package delivery in the house.
One last question: similarity to secondhand smoke with vaping. What is that similarity?
The short answer is we're not sure yet. It's still very early in this game. The longer answer is that cigarette secondhand smoke is very clearly a huge problem and is a cancer risk for people. The secondhand smoke that comes with vaping is not as concentrated, certainly doesn't contain all of the other ingredients that you get from burning leaf tobacco. Probably there is some, but when we inhale vape smoke, we don't inhale all of the nicotine that comes in with it. A lot of it comes back out. And so there is some of that that's in the air around. Even though there's not a smell, there's some of that. I don't know whether there's good data yet, I haven't seen anything, to suggest that that's its own public health issue. It's a public convenience issue for sure.
Yeah.
These are the kids that are taking over the bathrooms and filling the whole place up at the high school. That is itself a problem. It's not clear, however, just what degree of harm the nicotine is causing.
When I'm walking in the streets of New York and there's everybody vaping in front of me, or a lot of people, I try to hold my breath or turn my head. I feel like, because there's not enough known about it, because of the sticky aerosol residue component of it, I don't want it coating my lungs.
Yeah.
I remember in the 80s, when everybody had big hair, there was hairdressers dying because their lungs were coated with hairspray because they were exposed to it so much as a work hazard that their lungs lost their ability to, expel anything that shouldn't be there, and they eventually were dying. And I mean, again, I would not breathe it in.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your knowledge. I think this is going to be super helpful for parents out there that have kids that may be vaping, could potentially be vaping, to have those conversations and to really understand the effects. So again, thank you, Karen. Thank you, Pat.
It was my
Dr.
pleasure.
Egan.